You're with Julian on the Brown Note and how to not make friends and influence people. Why I stand with J.K. Rowling. I feel like everything is so polarised in the modern era that you can take someone that's an obvious lefty, liberal-leaning person like J.K. Rowling, and they can say one thing that's against a current paradigm, such as her comments about trans, and it's an immediate push to have them cancelled and removed and, you know, boycott their books, the author of the Harry Potter books, and much more since. If you missed it, in December last year, she came out in support of Mayor Forstater, whose worst comments were jarring about trans women. Men cannot change into women, and about calling trans women men. And she lost her job over it, even though these were her private political opinions published on Twitter, I believe. Much of what she said wasn't that polemic at all. It was a lot more sort of reason. But anyway, she got the boot, and she's currently in court. I believe she got excoriated by a judge for the commentary, and it's on appeal at the moment. And Rowling tweeted in support, and an avalanche of abuse came. In June this year, Rowling tweeted criticism of the phrase "people who menstruate." Now, I saw that ad. I think it was from something like CNN or something, and they put it up there, describing something for people getting cervical cancer tests or something for people who menstruate. And the problem was the fact they couldn't say women. It's more convoluted than that. I'll go into that in a bit. She said that she ended up putting a huge thing online saying she's a survivor of domestic abuse and sexual assault. Said throwing the doors of bathroom open to anyone that wants to go in or identifies as a woman is dangerous. And in August, she returned a Human Rights Award to the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Organization, who called her transphobic. And she said, "Nope, I don't want your award anymore. I'm going to stand up for what I believe." Why I broadly stand with her, I can't think of another group of people who could be considered marginalised or oppressed, who are denied ownership of their own issue, who can't have their own story. Every time I see this issue talked about, it's always from the starting point of trans rights over the top of women's rights. And any attempt to make it a woman's rights thing is immediately dismissed and problematic, and everyone talks over the top of feminist issues, saying that it has to acknowledge trans women as a starting point, and then we can move on to women's rights. I can't think of another group where it's okay to talk over the top of them, telling a woman how they must identify and define what being a woman is to a biological woman. I'm not telling a woman how it feels to be a woman or what constitutes being a woman. I'm not telling a woman that how they feel and their story isn't valid. It would be obscene to do that to a black person or a gay person or a trans person. Trans people deserve the amount of attention they've got, and they get ownership of their own issue, their identity, their story. But it seems like feminists now, if they define themselves biologically as women, the first thing that's thought of is that this is anti-trans. And I can't think of another group where they don't get ownership of their story and issue before it goes on to being about another group. It seems to be every single time that it comes up about being a biological woman that we have to include the prism of trans as the way that we look at feminism. And now there are TERFs, or trans exclusionary radical feminists, who are apparently people defining womanhood as biological womanhood first. Now, I don't think that's radical. There may well be feminists that are dismissive of trans rights, but I don't see that having ownership of your own issue the same way black or gay people would have before it goes out to any other group is radical. I think that's perfectly reasonable, and I would say the same for trans people. I would put an aside here. We focus a lot on trans women's rights, but I think trans men are invisible. as far as the political sphere and the media sphere goes. I mean, we've got so many prominent trans women like Caitlyn Jenner to RuPaul that are in the wide media landscape. I can't name a trans man that's a famous person. So that's weird, but that's not part of the issue. But I'm not telling a woman her reproductive organs aren't important, or calling her something different like a person with a uterus, or defining what actually being a woman to her is, or whether she thinks that these things are important. Biological women are still the largest oppressed group on earth. Women in general biological women are the widest, most oppressed group that we have. Bigger than black people and bigger than gay people. Is, more than 50% of the human race are female, and even though we have our own paradigm of oppression in the Western world, outside of the developed world, that oppression is pretty much a daily life. If you're a trans woman and you want to be called just a woman, I will certainly do that. I will call you what you want. But it seems like you've got ownership of your story and identity as a trans woman, and then also you have the ownership of biological women's rights first. And I don't agree with that. I mean, if you want to be called a woman, I'll call you a woman, but I'm not saying that a biological woman is something different to being a woman and calling them a person with a uterus. I know that trans men, will have a uterus, and so that's exclusatory to them to say a biological woman. But this is a fraction of people, and we're talking over 50% of the population of this planet to reach a very small minority of people first. And I think that if a woman wants to define her reproductive organs as being part of who she is as a woman, and that being important to her and having ownership of her own story, I'm doing that. I understand that a very small minority of people are trans men that will feel excluded by that, but I'm not erasing one group to give rights to another group. And I'm not calling it radical if you believe that biological womanhood is an important part of your story. Most of the people I see complaining about this issue aren't trans people at all. It's the usual suspects. And if you go to rights groups, they're always going to take the most extreme position, and they're the ones that are hammering J.K. Rowling about this. I'm not going to tell her she's wrong for including the stuff about sexual abuse or about admitting trans women to bathrooms, but I feel that is an unnecessary distraction. It's her story, and I'm not the person to tell her that her story isn't valid. But I think that it makes it too easy to then make the story about whether you agree with her comments about trans women going into bathrooms being a problem, and whether you agree or disagree, that kind of defines whether you agree or disagree with the wider story about whether biological women get ownership of their issue. I think it makes it too easy to distract from that core issue which she's raised. So I'm happy to stand for trans rights universally, but I'm not going to erase or talk over the top of a woman who stands up, who says that this is my identity and my story. And a lot of trans women haven't grown up as biological women to have that story. So I don't think it's fair that we talk over the top of women when they come forward and say, or hammer them and say that they're being anti-trans in the first instance. Why is everyone else not being anti-biological women in the first instance? I can't think of another group where we would talk about black people or gay people in the same erasing way. I would say an aside, LGBT people, when those groups have arrived at prominence to get their rights, we've managed to delineate. We had gay rights and we had gay and lesbian rights. When gay women appeared on the scene asking for their rights, we didn't erase gay men, and vice versa. They got gay and lesbian, we got a delineation, and when there have been other groups added to that, they've also got, bi, trans, queer, they've all got their own groups. So I don't understand why we have to suddenly say we wouldn't give lesbians their rights and say that we then have to erase gay people and call them something different. And that happens with women solely. I can't think of another group that would be even comparably treated the way that women, biological women, are when it comes to standing up for their story, their issue, their identity, their politics, their rights, in the way that this has happened. So I broadly support J.K. Rowling in what she's done. I also support trans women's rights, and I don't agree that we should erase one group for the other. So there you go.